court to the cloud. And so I'd like formally on the recording to welcome Richard, and he's going to lead us in this Bible study. Once again, many thanks for doing so, and I'll hand over to him now.
It's my privilege, thank you. I need to offer, you're supposed to never start with an apology, aren't you? But I've got some IT problems. My computer laptop has webcam issues, and I can't see at the moment who's on the call. I'm having to use my phone Zoom. So I'll just have a quick look across by sliding my screen, if I may. And I please say hello to Ruth and David, and to George and a companion, I think, Christine, Ted, someone whose name is Lynn, but I don't think his name is Lynn.
That's David again. Yeah,
that's David again. Okay, we've got John and Chris and Angela and Melanie and Angie and Stephen. So forgive me for zooming across my phone like that. I have tried to launch on my computer as well, so I can see you more clearly, but my computer's on a go slow at the moment. So
will you be wanting to share, Richard? Share screen? Or
I won't be able to share, I don't think. So that facility would be good, but
is it, if you wish to, you could email me the screen, email me the PowerPoint.
When I realised that I was going to have webcam problems, I decided I was probably going to end up with my phone. So I've not prepared a PowerPoint because didn't think I'd be able to do it. So it's just me, I'm afraid. Anyway, apologies aside, it's lovely to be with you, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and share some time together. And it's a really good thing to be doing, to share some time, particularly in a vacancy, to have a look at the marks of mission. And Chris asked me to come and give some thoughts, focusing from a Bible passage on the mark, which is to respond to human need by loving service. And the context in which I'm coming from, just so that you know a little bit about my setting, I'm team vicar at St Anne's in Chasetown. That's part of the Burntwood Chase benefice, in which there are 4 churches. St Anne's is one of them, and the St John's Chase Terrace, St John the Baptist Hammerwich, and Christ Church Burntwood. And one of the features of recent months in our benefice has been the creation of something called Burntwood Be a Friend, sort of a COVID mutual aid group. And that's enabled the church to be a part of a wider group of people who are trying to seek and serve those who are in particular need. And certainly during the pandemic, in its height, there was a lot of calls for help and need. And part of my involvement, both during my time at Chasetown and in a previous parish, has also been to help to start something called the Link for Life project, which helps local churches and schools to partner with communities in Southern Africa through 2 or 3 charity partners, the main one being Hands at Work in Africa. And so both of those aspects of local work and international help, I guess, have informed my choice of passage for today, and also some of the questions that come from it. So what I'm going to suggest we do is take a moment to pray just now, and then I'll have a look at the passage that we're going to study and move us through a short talk, and then leave us with some time for questions. Let's take a moment to be still. Living God, we thank you that you are always a God who is in mission. You are seeking to save, to rescue, to redeem. And thank you that you give your church the incredible responsibility and privilege of joining with you in that. So Lord, open our eyes and our hearts today as we look at part of the Bible to understand more of your heartbeat for mission, Lord, and your heartbeat for those in greatest need. Help us, we pray, through the presence of your Holy Spirit. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So the passage that I've chosen as the main focus was one which I sent to Chris a few days ago, coming from the start of Mark's Gospel. And it's a particular, I don't want to say favourite, but it's one I keep returning to. Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. And it may be that you were able to get sight of this and some sort of prompt questions before our study today.
Yeah, they should, people have been able to download it from the website, Richard. So
great. Okay, so if you have, wonderful. If you haven't, not to worry. I'm going to read from the New International Version, but I would encourage you, wherever you're listening to this or watching it, to use whichever version that you've got to hand and follow it as I read, if that's okay. It's obviously near the start of Mark's Gospel, so that says something to us that this is something that Mark was very keen for us to know about Jesus' ministry and focus. So, Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and begged him on his knees, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priests and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. So there are a couple of sort of little footnotes to mention there as a starter. Firstly, leprosy is in the Bible covers more a greater breadth of skin diseases than just the disease that we would now have diagnosed as leprosy. So anything which was a skin disorder might well have been given the sort of broad title of leprosy in biblical times. So we don't know whether the man suffered from what we now call leprosy or whether it was some other sort of skin disease. But certainly he would have been in the category of a person who was required to live outside the community. Secondly, when it says that Jesus was indignant in verse 41, that's a difficult to translate word. And some of the original manuscripts have one word and some have another. The two words are translated variously in different ways. Indignant and filled with compassion, and we'll come to that in a little while. But if you've got different versions for the word indignant, it's not that there's a mistranslation, it's that in the different versions that were before the translators, as they came to put together the English Bible, there were different scripts, one with a word which means indignant and one with a word which means, well, ends up being translated as filled with compassion. We'll have a think about that in a little while. What I'd like to do, if I may, is to take us through some observations, really pretty much sort of verse by verse, and then we'll see what we can learn together about our response with loving service. I guess on the best of our days, all of us would want to respond to any situation of human need with loving service. It's for somebody who's a disciple of Jesus, it is what we would hope we would do. And often, though, in my experience, things get more complicated than simply what I would like to do in the best of my days. So our journey through this passage really is with a view to helping us see, well, how does Jesus do it? What are the things that we can learn about our individual response with loving service and that of our churches in these days, in whatever way we would describe someone's need? So first of all, in the passage, I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the fact that Jesus and this man who we're told has leprosy, that they meet at all, because the man would have been prohibited from being around what we might call normal society. It's very unlikely that he would have been able to meet Jesus unless Jesus was in his neighborhood. And that's a reasonable presumption. And you then come to the question, well, why would Jesus be in his neighborhood? In fact, the more we look through all the Gospels, it shouldn't surprise us, because as you read through all of the four Gospels, we'll come across the situation where Jesus, in many, many times, in all four of the Gospels, Jesus is coming across people who are at the edges of mainstream society, lepers, sinners, those in mourning, the Samaritans, the region of the Gerasenes. All of these are edgy places on edgy people. The truth is, you don't, in New Testament times, just happen to come across somebody with leprosy. And this, I think, tells us something really important about Jesus's ministry, in that he was in the habit of going to the places where the people in need were likely to be. That says to us that Jesus went out looking for the last, the least, and the lost, to use a phrase used by Mike Pilavachi. And that says to us that Jesus is deliberate about meeting people who are in a point of need. And I think that's a challenge for us, because often we will find ourselves choosing, I speak personally myself, subliminally, we'll end up going to places where we know we won't be disturbed, where there won't be any ethical or social demands placed upon us. Jesus does the opposite. He goes looking and is amongst those in need. Interestingly, there's a comment from a writer that I really appreciate, someone called Shane Claiborne, who is founder of a movement called The Simple Way in Philadelphia in the US. And he says this: it's not that Christians do not care about the poor, it's that they don't know anyone who is poor. And obviously that's from his context in the US. But it brings to us the questions: if we find ourselves trying to put a distance between ourselves and people who present a need, we're probably going in the opposite direction to the one that Jesus went in. It makes us think about what are the risks of seeking out those who are in need. And equally, what are the risks and consequences of not seeking people in that setting? This, for me, I think, this first section is probably the most demanding for us as Christians and as churches, because the setting of many of our churches have near the top of their priority, how do we keep the door open? How do we thrive as a community, as a faith community? And actually, Jesus' dynamic seems to be much more edgy, risky, one where there is less of a preserving dynamic, but more of an outward flow. Often I find that the church is so busy trying to keep the door open that it forgets to go through it. Secondly, then, the man seems to question whether Jesus is willing to help rather than if he is able. He says, if you are willing, almost questioning Jesus' desire or heart to do this. And I wonder, why might the man have wondered about whether Jesus cared enough to help him? Might it be that other teachers who the man had come across had failed to care? Or perhaps that they thought his condition was his own fault in some way, or that it was a consequence of the way he had lived his life? All too often, when we see someone in need, we can easily find ourselves justifying our lack of response because of what we perceive about the situation of the person before us. Of course, there's a right need to look at the causes of the need, and we'll perhaps explore a little bit of this later, but the immediate response is one for compassion. And it seems that this had been lacking, I think, in the responses that the man had had up to now, which is why perhaps he questioned Jesus' willingness. Thirdly, I think very significantly, Jesus, we're told, touches the man, and that he does this before he heals or cleanses the man, depending on how you want to interpret that phrase. And it may be that the man if the man did have leprosy, and depending on where Jesus touched him, it may be that the man may not have been able to feel the touch that Jesus touched him with. But in some ways, I think that may miss the point. whether or not the man could feel Jesus' touch, he would have not had anyone reaching out to touch him for a long time with his tag of being a leper. So the social isolation of not having anyone approach you or move towards touching you must have been massive for this man. And maybe Jesus knew this and knew that the man's need was not just to be well, but also to be accepted and included, treated as a fellow human and not as a disease or a social problem. And that says to me that when people are in our company who have needs, often those needs are much wider and deeper than the one that we first notice. Fourthly, Jesus heals the man and reassures him in that he is willing. Jesus heals him, and of course that's vital. The man can now, once he is certified as clean, can rejoin his family and his normal life. But it's also important that he knows that he matters to Jesus. So Jesus telling him that he is willing is a significant one. It's not anything that Jesus is saying, well, I just want you out my way. I'll give you a few quid to get you out of my immediate area. Jesus isn't healing him to remove the social problem which he represents. And often, when we come across someone who might be begging or selling a big issue or whatever, it can be tempting for us to give a donation or help someone so that they're no longer a problem to our conscience, rather than genuinely helping them out of compassion. And fifthly, Jesus tells him to go to the priest and offer the sacrifices for his cleansing. Now, this is important, I believe, because the certificate of cleansing which the priest would issue was the means by which the man would be able to officially rejoin society, showing that Jesus is seeing the whole person. He heals the man, but also restores him into the social setting, which will enable him to live and thrive without being questioned, no longer kind of in the back spaces. The fact that the man doesn't follow this advice, I think, is also significant. Maybe, and this is a little bit of conjecture, maybe the man spent so long as an outsider that rejoining society is actually a very big step indeed, which is why Mark tells us that the man doesn't seem to do immediately what Jesus says, but instead goes about, perhaps in his own network, rather than rejoining mainstream society. And it says to me that kind of the habits which people move in when they have a particular issue or need may be ones that they need to continue in, because it's a place where they feel comfortable, where they're known, and where they know the dynamics of what are going on. So if we're seeking to help someone out of any form of addictive behavior, it's not a surprise if they find it hard to leave the group of people who they've known and been alongside, because they have been the people they've had fellowship with. And unless we give them immediate new links into a fresh group of a community of love, they're going to find that move extremely hard, if that's what they should do. So that's a quick tour through the passage, and there may be some questions which emerge out of that. But there are the three little quotes that I'd like to offer us, which kind of, I think, go alongside this and give some interesting angles on the passage too. The first of them is a misremembered quote from Jim Wallace, who is a US pastor, who says this, and I have got his quote wrong, so forgive me for not being precise. But in essence, he says, after a while, when you keep pulling people out of the river, you end up asking who is throwing them in upstream. Related to that, one that you may be familiar with, from Dom Helder Kamara, when I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no bread, they call me a communist. And finally, to go alongside this, is a quote from which John Stott mentions in his book Issues Facing, New Issues Facing Christians Today, which is a fully named book, so it's well over 20 years old. But nevertheless, it's worth reading because this section here relates to a situation that he was informed about. Let's see if I can find the right section. He reports that a country vicar was met by a homeless woman who turned to him for help. And the country vicar, doubtless, he says sincerely, and because he was busy and felt helpless, promised to pray for her. It says she later wrote this poem and handed it to a regional officer of shelter. It reads like this: I was hungry, and you formed a humanities group to discuss my hunger. I was imprisoned, and you crept off quietly to your chapel and prayed for my release. I was naked, and in your mind, you debated the morality of my appearance. I was sick, and you knelt and thanked God for your health. I was homeless, and you preached to me of the spiritual shelter of the love of God. I was lonely, and you left me alone to pray for me. You seem so holy, so close to God, but I am still very hungry and lonely and cold. So just in rounding off the sort of taught input from this morning, some questions to help us, and I perhaps would be good after this to open up for discussion amongst us if we can, and I'll try and see if I can get my computer to play, and then I'll be able to see who's speaking. I think just as a little bit of a thought response, first of all, have a think about how each of us feels in connection with our response to people who you know or who are poor or are in need. So perhaps have a think about someone who you know, perhaps in your network or in your neighborhood, a colleague, a friend, a relative. What's the emotions that come to you when you meet that person? It's worth holding on to what that emotion is, because being able to get in touch with the emotion of compassion, I think is at the heart of a response here. And that word that we find translated earlier as either indignant or filled with compassion is one that's worth a bit of thought, really. The word translated filled with compassion is a Greek word. I think, see if I can pronounce it correctly, splankthesis, and it basically means almost a shuddering, being so disturbed. And the person I've heard best described talked about almost the whinnying of a horse, where the whole horse's body shakes because of the disturbance that whatever has happened has caused. I'm not a horse person, and I could be corrected on that, but now the idea is that the being filled with compassion is something that so moves Jesus here that there's a bodily response. It is not just, oh, I feel sorry for it, oh, poor thing, bless. There's a visceral response in Jesus, and some of us may know that regularly, others less frequently. And I think one of the issues around that is when we might be so moved with compassion that we are moved to being indignant about it. And that's where maybe that the translation of that word actually fits both of those two words which the ancient manuscripts have had, that Jesus was both filled with compassion and he was indignant and felt the need to do something about it. The question that follows on, I guess, as well, bearing in mind what the Shane Claiborne quote said, was that do we feel that many people in our churches, in our neighborhood or whatever, do we feel we know the names of people who are genuinely poor or in need? And the reason I'm asking about knowing names is that we might know people by sight, perhaps someone we pass in the street, but if we know their name, it means that we are in some kind of relationship with them, and therefore in a position to be able to do more than passing help. If we don't know many people's names who are in need, is that okay? And if it's not, how might it change? What can we do when we feel threatened by the circumstances of someone who is in need? It's a difficult one there, because this brings into the issues of risk and of wisdom, and of whether our ability to help as an amateur cuts across a statutory group that might have responsibilities to support and help someone. It's difficult to know that, really. And the question that I guess also is worth holding alongside that is, what can we do when we do not feel compassion for a person who is in genuine need? If we feel that we've kind of got compassion fatigue, sometimes people describe it as, when we've perhaps been exposed to so much need that we've ended up kind of shutting down our noticing of it. Or the alternative might be that perhaps we've been so rarely exposed to it that we don't know what to do, and so we put up our defences. I'm going to pause us there. There's some other prayers and responses that I can lead us with, and some other passages, but now might be a good time to have some discussion. The questions that I put onto the sheet, which I think Chris put onto the website, are ones that we can discuss as well now. I'll try and see if I can get my computer to speak to me so that I can see those who are on the call just now. Chris, you might need to let me in if that's okay, please, when the time comes. But I'll pause there, and Chris, if I hand over to you to chair that until I can see everybody.
Okay. Well, you have just appeared, Richard, and I'm admitting you. So you might.
That's great news. It's taken this length of time for my computer to actually acknowledge that I'm here. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I think you need to mute one of your things, Richard.
Yep, I've just done that. Thank you.
So the first hand I see go up is Christine Pelhill. Unmute Chris, please. Thank you.
Richard, I'm not sure that everyone knows what Burnt Would Be a Friend does. And I think it's so relevant to this passage that, I mean, if I'm wrong and you all wave your hand and say, I know everything about Burnt Would Be a Friend, fine. But I think it's such a good example of a way of working out, and it's got so many little ramifications that it would be really helpful to us if you'd share a bit about it.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Yep, good. Okay, so Burnt Would Be a Friend didn't exist until March of last year, and essentially a group of churches and other local social charities in Burntwood all started to do what they thought was going to be helpful for people in the Burntwood area who were in need as the pandemic and the lockdown began to take effect. And several of the church leaders came together and said it would be better if we clubbed together on this rather than all doing our own thing. So we took some advice from Support Staffordshire and Skivvies, who are sort of statutory, who are volunteer support agencies, and formed a sort of COVID mutual aid group called Burnt Would Be a Friend. The invitation being basically not to say we're going to do this for you, we're going to do everything that's there, but a challenge to say, okay, if you live in Burntwood, it's time to be a friend. What that then set up was a daily helpline where people could phone or email in every day. Initially, it's now Monday to Friday, 10 till 12, and people could phone in with either requests for shopping if they were isolating, prescription collections, if there were finance issues, food shortages. We teamed up with so there's a series of call handlers who dealt with all that. Those were triaged and then sent on to a network of volunteers that we'd recruited, which came from pretty much all areas of the different parts of Burntwood. We teamed up with local supermarkets who started giving us surplus fresh food that they couldn't sell because it was near to the end of its sell-by date, but we could make it available to people who would be grateful of it. And we also started to partner with the Burntwood Food Bank. So quite quickly it became an umbrella organisation where people who were in need in the area could come to and then be directed to someone who might be able to help in some way. We have set up a food help point. So St Anne's Church has now got a marquee outside on its front lawn where there's a food distribution point every Monday, where folk who want to ask for a bit of help, and that's happened throughout the pandemic, throughout lockdown. We've been able to maintain that, with all the normal social distancing regulations that we've had to abide by. And I think for people who have really found the strains of lockdown and the finance issues really problematic, it's been a real lifeline. We were able to get some funding from National Lottery and from the Coalfields Regeneration Trust and Staffordshire Community Foundation and Burntwood Town Council. And we're now seeking to make it into a sort of light touch charity, which is a community interest operation. So going forward, it's going to be likely to be helping people with ongoing mental health and well-being issues. I think will be the major focus of what we're doing there. And certainly in terms of challenging isolation, it's been an important support for lots of people there. So there's been many doorstep visits that have happened. We've set up a befriending group so that folks who weren't able to get out because of needing to be isolated because of ongoing health conditions, if they wish to, could have a regular phone call from a trained befriender, not a counsellor. And some of those have become doorstep visits as well. We've worked alongside MHA communities and sort of worked in partnership with them. And our aim hasn't really been to do everything, but to sort of fill the gaps, I think, to stop people falling through them. And we've been grateful to Chris and John for regular donation to fresh food and other bits and pieces from Reflections Garden. But certainly from my point of view as a Christian, as a Christian minister in Chasetown, I've discovered more people in need than I knew were here. And if I'd only linked in with the church connections, I wouldn't have come across lots of people in really quite high levels of need. The instances for me is that I now know the names of quite a number of people who have really had extreme need in the course of the last number of months. And a lot of them have been single males living in multiple occupancy houses that I didn't know existed. And it's opened up to me a greater level of insight about the level of need in the parish that I've been in for over 5 years now. And I'm a bit ashamed that it took this to let me know that. So that's a whistle-stop tour through Burntwood Be a Friend. Does that help, Chris?